So as someone who was campaigning on climate and took science seriously in other areas, I didn't feel that I should continue being anti-GMO when basically the science was pushing all in completely the opposite direction.
It was quite a journey for you, though, from somebody who used to go around ripping up crops.
Yeah, yes, that's true. I mean, I did do my fair share of crop ripping up. I mean, that was a long time ago. That was way back in the late 1990s. And I guess GMO crops were new at that point. I mean, they've now been in the ground for 30 years, and so we have a very long history of safe use, and we know they're pretty much the same as any other crops and food. But I mean, I guess at that time, in my defence, it was a novel technology, and we thought there might be risks. We now see that there isn't any additional risk, but that was the thing that I felt strongly about. But as you say, I changed my mind, and I think it's important. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to do a U-turn like that, but I guess it's important if the science changes and your understanding changes, that you change your mind and you change your behaviour as a result.
Okay, so what do you think of New Zealand's approach to genetic modification?
New Zealand's approach is stuck back in the 1990s, as far as I can tell. It hasn't been updated. It's still based on this idea that there's something risky about genetic technologies, which is unfortunate and probably harming the environment, because there's a lot that can be done now with genetic modification and all the new technologies of gene editing, which can make farming more sustainable, like reduce pesticide use and all the things which us environmentalists think are desirable. So it's kind of, what's the word, antediluvian for New Zealand to still have this prohibitionary regime on GMOs. It's a bit like saying we weren't going to take the COVID vaccine because that too was genetically engineered. So it's time to get into the 21st century in New Zealand.
Well, why? I mean, you've studied this. Why do you think there are countries like New Zealand which have this approach still to GM?
I think it's a matter of PR, essentially. I mean, there's this sort of mental image of GMOs as being bad for the environment, and so countries like New Zealand, or I think Tasmania is one as well in Australia, they say they want to, be clean and green. And actually Scotland's the same in the United Kingdom. But it's just a matter of image. It's not a matter of science, and there's never any science they can use to justify that. And in fact, it's harmful to the environment that they maintain this kind of restrictive regime against new science. But they do it because they think it's going to help their exports, or it just helps their image, or they're just out of date.
Right. So you say that GM food can help us through climate change. How is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, there's basically genetic modification allows you to do different new traits in plants and animals, basically. So, for example, in Africa at the moment, there's drought-tolerant maize, corn as they call it in the United States, which can obviously help smallholder farmers produce a better harvest when the rains don't come. That's a climate change adaptation measure, because climate's affecting rainfall patterns and making it drier in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So if these countries turn around and say we don't want GM, then they can't use that technology, and the farmers get less harvest, and that worsens food insecurity. So that's just one example, but there's many others, of course. Okay,
but there are groups like Greenpeace who are still anti-GMO because they believe that it's linked with increased pesticide and chemical use. Is that true?
It's complicated because it depends on which chemicals you're talking about. So the first generation of GM crops were bred to be tolerant of Roundup, or otherwise known as glyphosate, which is a weed killer. So it's a herbicide. So basically, the idea was that farmers sprayed that in the fields. It got rid of the weeds. It made it much easier for them to cultivate, but that was increasing the use of that particular chemical. Most other GM crops use insect-resistant technology, so they've got genes in there which mean that it kills the insects. Then you don't need to spray insecticides, which tend to be much more harmful chemicals. So on balance, GM crops have reduced the use of the most harmful synthetic chemicals. And that's, I think, why Greenpeace has largely dropped that campaign. I mean, you won't see, certainly not in the UK or many other countries, Greenpeace campaigning against this, because I think they also realise that the world's moved on.
OK. There is this concern, though, that big agriculture could end up controlling the technology, and therefore they could control the world food supply. Is that the situation in terms of the big companies being able to just say, we own these kinds of technologies?
Well, the world we're living in is big companies own just about everything, including that, and including most of the food that we buy and eat every day. And that's the world we're living in, and it goes for organic seeds and everything else as well. By the way, so it's not something which is unique to genetic technology. And in fact, there are lots of small startups who use the technology doing open source. As I say, also for sub-Saharan Africa. for smallholder farmers in many developing countries. So it's a technology that can be used in different ways by different actors. There's nothing inherent about it, which means that it helps big companies.
Okay, just finally, whakapapa or genealogy is a key concept for some of those Indigenous peoples that you're talking about. Does genetic modification present a challenge to those kind of cultural beliefs?
I think it may well do. I mean, it's a challenge to our ethics and our understanding of the world, knowing what we do know now about genomics and genes in general and genetics. And it gives us the power. I mean, if you look at synthetic biology, we have the power to create novel forms of life from synthetic, just from inanimate elements, if you like. And this is a power that humans haven't had before. We have the power to genetically alter all the plants and animals, and including ourselves. So we need to update our ethics about this. And yes, it does. I think it does challenge our understanding of the world and what nature what that actually means, including to Indigenous peoples. I don't think that means we have to block it, but it does mean that we need to think seriously and deeply about these things and what they mean to all of us.
Mark Lynas in Wales,